civil society organizations have formed their own panel on electoral reform. The My Vote Counts says this move follows civil society being snubbed by Parliament and the former Home Affairs Minister for a legislatively required electoral reform panel appointed in May. The Civil Society Electoral Reform Panel was launched by My Vote Counts at the Constitutional Hill in Johannesburg on Friday. Joining us to discuss this further is political systems researcher at My Vote Counts, Boikanyo Moloto. Good evening, Boikanyo. Thank you very much for joining us. So as civil society, you have resolved not to sulk and continue to challenge the exclusion of yourselves from the minister's panel. You've formed and launched your own. But before we touch on the work ahead for the specific panel, I wanted us to first touch on, or at least if you could remind us of the issues and state of our electoral system currently that necessitates to this day meaningful electoral reform.
Thank you, Nomfundo. Well, the conversation of electoral reform has really been in existence since the dawn of our democracy in South Africa. The electoral system was chosen for its simplicity and its inclusivity for the context at the time due to the transition, but the conversations have been ongoing since then. We've had two major task teams that were formed, the Van Zyl Commission in 2003, as well as the Ministerial Advisory Committee in 2020 to advise on electoral reform, but none of their recommendations were implemented. The biggest headway we have made in electoral reform is the inclusion of independence that you just mentioned. And we do feel that electoral reform is very necessary in order to improve the facets of our democracy, such as accountability, such as transparency, such as the influence of money in politics. So those are the main issues that we'd like to focus on in improving our democracy as it relates to electoral reform specifically.
Then to the work of the panel. Just talk us through what lies ahead for the specific panel and even which organizations are represented in that panel.
So the formation of the panel was not established. It wasn't established as a result of the state panel. It wasn't established to be in opposition to the state panel. It really is an idea that came about last year. And we felt that this would be a great initiative for civil society to show our continued commitment to democracy and improving the democracy in South Africa. So with the panel, we've got 8 panelists, which is myself from My Vote Counts. So it's made up of representatives from different organizations. We have Thapelo Mohapi, who is part of Abahlali Basemjondolo, the Secretary General. We've got Terry Tselane, who is the Executive Chairperson of IMSA. We've got Nonga Domadube Dube, who's the Executive Director of Equal Education. Nontando Ngamlane, Executive Director of FISIS, Mazibuko Jaka, who's the Chairperson of Zavala Pathways Institute. We have Dan Mafura, who's the Senior Researcher at KSEC, and Alfred, who represents Defend Our Democracy. So we've got a really great mix. We look forward to contributing in a meaningful way, but a constructive way as well. We'll also be hiring the services of a research consultant who's an expert on electoral matters, so that when we form this panel and are the guardians of particular democratic principles, she's able to align us to the work that we are trying to do and keep us on track in terms of what is possible and what is not possible with regards to the electoral system itself.
Boikanyo, you touched on a very important point, that you don't seek to compete, but to complement the work of the appointed panel, the one from Parliament and the Home Affairs Minister. But how will you go about complementing it? When will you make your contributions to this other panel that was formed before yours?
Certainly. So part of the work of the panel is coming up with a framework where at the end we would then recommend a particular electoral system that we think would fit best for our context upon reflection of the past 30 years, but also the South Africa that we imagine in the next 30 to 50 years. Part of that work will also be making submissions to the state panel. They've just put out a call for recommendations, and we'll be making submissions. Obviously, there will be points of convergence and divergence, but I do think that we as a panel would like to work more collaboratively, and hopefully that works best for South Africa.
All right, Boikanyo, thank you very much for joining us this evening and just taking us through this work, or rather the work of this particular panel. That was My Vote Counts political systems researcher, Boikanyo Moloto.